Evan Carrow never expected his biggest secret to become the evidence that destroyed his life. Please subscribe for daily new update of Crime Story and watch till end. Lakewood Ridge appeared to be the kind of place where nothing dark ever happened. With its tree-lined streets, identical white fences, and families who waved to each other every morning, it gave the impression of a peaceful and predictable life. But beneath that calm surface, there were lives quietly falling apart, and one of them belonged to Evan Carrow. At 22, Evan had already lived through more emotional storms than most people twice his age. After dropping out of college, he returned home with no clear direction, carrying a sense of failure that followed him like a shadow. His mother welcomed him warmly, but she spent most of her time traveling for her marketing job. That left Evan alone with his wealthy stepfather, Martin Huxley, a man known in town for his confident posture, expensive suits, and strict discipline. Martin owned several small businesses around Lakewood Ridge, and many people admired him for his success, unaware of the complicated household he controlled. When Evan first moved back, neighbors noticed he rarely spoke, keeping his head low as he walked from the car to the house. They assumed he was shy or simply adjusting to life at home again. No one imagined he was stepping into an environment where emotional closeness and tension blended in ways that couldn't be easily explained. Martin had always taken a special interest in Evan. He paid for therapy sessions, helped him search for jobs, and spent long evenings guiding him about future plans. To outsiders, it looked like a stepfather trying to help a struggling young man regain stability. Inside the house, though, the relationship had soft edges that made the air feel heavy. Evan knew something was different about Martin's attention, but he didn't question it. After all, Martin was the only person who made him feel understood, even if that understanding came with an uneasy sense of dependency. That dependency grew stronger each month. Evan began relying on Martin's approval for every decision. Martin's calm voice became a source of comfort, while his disappointments cut deeper than anyone else's. By the start of winter, their bond had grown into something that no one outside the house suspected, something built on shared secrets, emotional closeness, and a constant fear of being discovered. Still, Lakewood Ridge remained unaware. People only saw the polished surface. Evan jogging quietly at dawn, Martin leaving for work in his spotless car, the mother returning from trips with small souvenirs and tired smiles. Everything appeared normal. The house itself, painted light blue with a trimmed lawn and a garden of roses, became a symbol of stability. Yet behind its windows, an emotional storm was forming, one powerful enough to destroy the illusion of the perfect neighborhood. Evan felt trapped between gratitude, confusion, and a growing sense of suffocation. Martin, meanwhile, held tighter to the control he believed he deserved. Their connection was becoming unstable, though neither of them fully understood how dangerous it was. What seemed like a quiet household was actually a place where unspoken feelings simmered dangerously beneath the surface, waiting for a moment to erupt and pull the entire family into a tragedy the town would never forget. Evan's return home brought a closeness between him and Martin that developed slowly, almost quietly, as if it were happening in the spaces between ordinary moments. At first, their interactions were simple and harmless. Martin often asked about Evan's day, offered advice about handling stress, and showed interest in his goals. For Evan, who felt directionless and uncertain, that attention felt comforting. It gave him a sense of being valued, something he had been missing for a long time. Martin's presence became a steady part of his daily routine, a kind of emotional anchor he didn't realize he depended on. As weeks passed, the connection between them deepened in ways neither fully acknowledged. Their conversations grew more personal, stretching late into the night while the rest of the house remained silent. Martin shared stories about his own past, about moments of loneliness, failures he rarely admitted to anyone, and hopes he never voiced publicly. Evan, who had always struggled to open up, found himself revealing his fears, insecurities, and the frustration he felt about not knowing his purpose in life. The closeness they built felt unusual but warm, like a bond that wasn't meant to be examined too closely. Martin began offering Evan more than advice. He bought him new clothes, helped him register for online classes, and even gave him access to one of his credit cards. He insisted it was to help Evan rebuild his confidence. Evan accepted it all with quiet gratitude, believing Martin genuinely cared about his future. But the more Martin gave, the more control he gained, creating a dependency that blurred the lines between guidance and possession. Evan started adjusting his schedule to match Martin's, waiting for him to come home and feeling restless whenever Martin spent extra hours at work. The secrecy grew gradually, slipping into their lives like a quiet visitor. They became more careful about how they interacted when Evan's mother was around. Martin stopped lingering in rooms too long, and Evan avoided sitting too close to him during meals. Their connection had crossed into a territory that neither wanted to explain or confront. It remained unspoken between them, a silent arrangement that relied on mutual understanding and a shared fear of exposure. Evan felt pulled in two directions. On one side, Martin made him feel important, seen, and supported in a way no one else did. On the other side, something about the relationship made him uneasy. He couldn't tell whether the closeness was solving his problems or creating new ones that he didn't know how to control. That confusion began affecting his behavior. He grew more withdrawn, often lost in thought, avoiding calls from old friends and skipping family gatherings. Meanwhile, Martin grew increasingly protective of Evan. He monitored his decisions, questioned his interactions with others, and subtly discouraged him from seeking independence. Their secret attachment became the quiet center of their lives, hidden behind closed doors and silent glances. What had started as emotional support evolved into a bond that neither of them fully understood, yet both felt compelled to maintain. It was this hidden connection, delicate and unstable, that would eventually shape the tragic path neither of them saw coming. The secrecy that had once felt exciting slowly turned into a source of fear for both Evan and Martin. The fragile balance they had maintained began to shift as reality pushed its way into their hidden world. Martin, who had always been confident and composed, started showing signs of strain. He became more cautious, sometimes even paranoid, checking doors twice and lowering his voice whenever Evan's mother returned home between work trips. The fear of someone discovering their secret tightened around him like a noose he couldn't escape. For Martin, reputation meant everything. His businesses depended on the trust of the community, and his social standing had been built carefully over years of discipline and control. The idea that anyone could uncover what he and Evan shared filled him with dread. He knew the consequences would be severe financial ruin, social isolation, and the collapse of everything he had created. The more he imagined the fallout, the more he felt the need to distance himself from Evan to protect his own life. But pulling away wasn't easy. Their connection had become too tangled, shaped by emotional dependency and the comfort they found in each other's company. Evan sensed the shift before anything was said outright. The warmth in Martin's tone became colder, his presence more distant. He began spending longer hours at work and avoided the late-night conversations that once brought them closer. Evan felt the loss like a sudden drop in temperature, something he couldn't ignore. The emotional support he had relied on was slipping away, leaving him with a hollow feeling he didn't know how to manage. His mind raced with questions, but none had answers that made sense. The pressure intensified as Martin started making practical changes. He locked away financial documents, restricted Evan's access to funds, and encouraged him to find more work or consider moving out. Though the suggestions were framed as guidance, they felt like a carefully crafted push toward separation. Evan recognized the signs, but felt powerless against them. His sense of identity had become bound to Martin, and the thought of losing him created a panic he struggled to suppress. Rumors around town didn't help. Lakewood Ridge thrived on quiet gossip, and small comments from neighbors about seeing Martin and Evan spending too much time together reached Martin's ears. Even though the comments were vague and harmless, they fueled his anxiety. He couldn't risk even a hint of suspicion spreading, so he began withdrawing even faster, creating emotional distance that left Evan confused and hurt. The growing tension in the house became impossible to ignore. Evan stopped sleeping well, often lying awake, listening to the faint sounds of Martin pacing late at night. The silence between them grew thicker, filled with unspoken worries neither dared to confront. Evan felt abandoned, convinced that Martin was pushing him aside now that he no longer needed him. He didn't realize that Martin's decisions were driven by fear rather than rejection. The emotional weight on both men grew heavier with each passing day, building pressure that neither knew how to release. What had once been a secret connection built on comfort had now turned into a threatening shadow hanging over their lives, preparing to trigger consequences they were not ready to face. The storm that had been building inside the house for months finally reached a breaking point on a night when Lakewood Ridge was drenched in heavy rain. The sky hung low and dark, and the streets were empty except for the occasional passing car, leaving streaks of light on the wet pavement. Inside the blue house, the tension was far thicker than the storm outside. Evan had spent the entire day restless, unable to shake the feeling that something irreversible was about to happen. Martin had barely spoken to him, retreating to his study with papers stacked around him like a barrier. The cold distance that had been growing between them now felt permanent, as if a line had been drawn that could no longer be crossed. As evening settled in, Evan wandered through the quiet house, overwhelmed by a mix of confusion and resentment. He replayed their last few weeks in his mind, trying to understand how their once intense bond had evaporated. His dependence on Martin had become a part of his identity, and the sudden detachment felt like an emotional collapse he wasn't prepared to handle. Every decision Martin had made recently, restricting money, avoiding conversations, hinting at separation, played in Evan's head like a series of confirmations that he was being discarded. The rain intensified, tapping against the windows in uneven rhythms. Lightning briefly illuminated the walls, casting sharp shadows that made the house feel unfamiliar. Evan felt himself growing increasingly anxious, pacing through the hallway with a knot tightening in his stomach. He knew Martin was inside the study, the one room he had always treated as his private world. That night, however, the closed door felt more like a wall, separating two lives that had once been intertwined. Hours passed, and the air grew heavier. Evan's emotions swung between fear, sadness, and an anger he didn't fully recognize. He couldn't understand why Martin had pushed him away so suddenly, as if their connection had never mattered. The more he thought about it, the more he felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal. He had trusted Martin with his vulnerabilities, and now he felt abandoned in the worst possible way. Near midnight, the sound of something falling inside the study cut through the silent house. Evan froze, unsure whether it was an accident or a sign that Martin was finally coming out. But the door remained closed. His heart raced. The emotional strain of the past months, combined with the loneliness and fear he carried, clouded his judgment. He approached the study slowly, drawn by a mixture of worry and desperation. What happened next unfolded in a rush of panic and confusion. The quiet study, lit only by the glow of a desk lamp, became the setting for a moment of chaos that neither man had ever imagined possible. The tension, the fear, the unresolved conflict, everything erupted in an instant. A struggle followed, filled with the kind of frantic energy that comes from emotions pushed beyond control. Objects were knocked over, papers scattered, and the sense of order Martin always maintained shattered completely. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the room fell silent except for the rain outside. The calm that followed felt unnatural, heavy, and filled with a sense of finality. Evan, overwhelmed by shock, confusion, and fear fled the house without any sense of direction. The storm swallowed him as he disappeared into the night, leaving behind a scene that would soon transform the quiet town of Lakewood Ridge into a center of tragic attention. Detectives arrived at the Huxley home early the next morning, alerted by a neighbor who had noticed the front door left slightly open while the storm clouds were still clearing. Inside, the house felt strangely quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The study, once a space of perfect organization, looked like it had been overtaken by chaos. Papers were scattered across the floor, books lay open in odd positions, and a decorative metal ornament rested on the carpet with a smear of fingerprints. In the center of the room, Martin Huxley lay motionless. His death was immediately apparent, and the area around him told investigators that the end had not come peacefully. The officers began carefully documenting every detail, moving slowly through the room to avoid disturbing evidence. They found overturned furniture, scratches on the floor, and a broken lamp that seemed to mark the path of the struggle. The room felt suffocated by the tension that had erupted there hours earlier. Nothing appeared staged or preplanned. Instead, the scene reflected a moment of emotional eruption, raw and uncontrolled. Investigators quickly realized this was not the work of a stranger. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, and no footprints from outside. Everything pointed to someone inside the home. Evan's absence became the first major clue. His bedroom was empty, the sheets rumpled, his phone missing, and a few personal items gone. To detectives, this looked less like a kidnapping and more like a desperate escape. They widened their search, questioning residents around Lakewood Ridge. Several neighbors reported seeing Evan pacing outside the house the previous evening during the storm, his movements restless and agitated. One neighbor even mentioned hearing faint noises during the night, but assumed it was just the storm rattling the old houses. As investigators moved deeper into Martin's personal files, they uncovered things that raised even more questions. Hidden inside a locked drawer was a folder containing printed messages exchanged between Martin and Evan over the past year. The tone of the messages shifted dramatically from affectionate and encouraging to tense and conflicted. Financial records showed unexplained transfers of money to Evan, followed by sudden restrictions placed on his access. Detectives noted these changes carefully, recognizing a pattern that suggested a complicated emotional entanglement. Then came the discovery that turned the investigation from mysterious to explosive. On Martin's personal laptop were saved photographs and documents that revealed the secret relationship he had shared with Evan. The detectives, though cautious in their interpretation, understood immediately that this connection was the key to understanding the motive. The secrecy, the dependency, the sudden distance, it all painted a picture of a relationship that had spiraled into emotional instability. Still, evidence alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed something tangible to link Evan directly to the moment of violence. They found it on the metal ornament lying near Martin's body. Clear fingerprint patterns overlapped across its surface, and preliminary analysis showed they belonged to Evan. Combined with his sudden disappearance, the case grew stronger against him. As news spread throughout Lakewood Ridge, shock rippled through the community. Residents who had admired Martin's polished image were stunned to learn of the hidden life he led. People who had barely noticed Evan began recalling every small interaction they'd had with him, trying to understand how the quiet young man could be involved in something so devastating. The police, certain they were close to solving the case, intensified their search. The evidence, emotional, digital, and physical, formed a picture difficult to deny. All signs pointed to Evan Carrow as the last person to see Martin alive, and likely the one responsible for the tragedy that had shattered the illusion of peace in their small town. 2 days after Martin's body was discovered, a search for Evan intensified across Lakewood Ridge and the surrounding counties. Patrol cars moved silently through forested backroads, while officers checked abandoned sheds, bus stations, and cheap motels. The story had already reached local news, and Evan's photo appeared on every screen. A young man with tired eyes, now labeled as the primary suspect in a shocking crime. People in town whispered about him constantly, replaying memories and wondering how someone who once seemed so reserved could end up at the center of such a violent investigation. The break in the search came unexpectedly. A park ranger reported seeing signs of recent activity near an old cabin several miles beyond town footprints in soft dirt, a half-burned piece of clothing, and food wrappers scattered nearby. Officers rushed to the location, surrounding the small cabin hidden between thick clusters of trees. The air felt heavy with anticipation as they approached the door. Inside, they found Evan curled in a corner, exhausted and trembling. He didn't resist. Something in him had already given up long before the officers arrived. His clothes were damp, his hair unkempt, and his entire demeanor reflected someone running not just from the police, but from himself. The arrest stunned the community even more than the discovery of Martin's body. People gathered outside their homes, watching police cars drive past with flashing lights. Many felt a mixture of disbelief and curiosity, while others quietly admitted they had sensed something unusual about the Huxley household, but never imagined this outcome. Evan's mother returned from a business trip in a state of shock, unable to understand how her family had collapsed while she was away. At the police station, investigators tried to piece together Evan's mindset. He appeared overwhelmed, unable to give a clear explanation for his disappearance. His statements drifted between fear, confusion, and moments of painful clarity. He spoke about feeling trapped, unsupported, and terrified of what would happen once the truth about his relationship with Martin surfaced. His emotional state made it difficult for detectives to distinguish regret from panic. But one thing was clear. Evan had not planned anything. His behavior seemed impulsive, driven by months of emotional instability. Meanwhile, news outlets uncovered details about Martin's secret life, and reporters camped outside the police department hoping for new developments. The once admired businessman was now the center of a hidden scandal, and people across town struggled to reconcile the polished public figure with the private choices that had come to light. Some residents felt sympathy for Evan, convinced he had been manipulated by someone older and more powerful. Others viewed him strictly as a murderer who had tried to escape responsibility. Inside the courtroom, as Evan was formally charged, the atmosphere felt heavy with judgment. The prosecution focused on the evidence, the fingerprints on the weapon, his sudden disappearance, and the documented emotional ties between him and Martin. The defense argued that Evan had been pushed to an emotional breaking point, trapped in a relationship he couldn't control or fully understand. The case quickly became one of the most complicated the town had seen. The arrest marked a turning point in the entire investigation. What had begun as a tragic household incident had now grown into a story filled with psychological complexity, hidden secrets, and emotional manipulation. The quiet town of Lakewood Ridge found itself forced to confront truths it never expected, as the lines between victim and offender blurred in ways that made the tragedy even more difficult to comprehend. The courtroom filled quickly on the day of Evan's trial, with reporters taking notes and residents of Lakewood Ridge settling into the back rows, eager to hear how the tragic story would finally unfold. The atmosphere was tense, and every person present seemed aware that this case was far more complicated than the simple headline it had become. Evan entered quietly, looking pale and exhausted, his posture reflecting the weight of everything he had carried for months. The once reserved young man now appeared hollow, as if each day since the incident had drained another part of him. The prosecution began by laying out the facts clearly and firmly. They described the physical evidence found in the study, highlighting the fingerprints on the metal ornament and Evan's sudden disappearance. They emphasized the turmoil within the Huxley household and the emotional dependency that had spiraled out of control. To them, the story was straightforward. A young man, overwhelmed by rejection and fear of exposure, had acted violently in a moment driven by anger. The details seemed to fit together neatly, and for a moment, the courtroom atmosphere grew heavy as the jury processed the narrative presented to them. But everything shifted when the defense introduced a new layer to the story. They presented audio diaries recorded by Martin, discovered on an encrypted drive investigators had initially overlooked. The recordings revealed a side of Martin that few knew existed. His voice, often calm in public, carried tones of fear, guilt, and internal conflict. He spoke about the pressure of maintaining his image, the secrecy that consumed his life, and his fear of the consequences if anyone discovered the truth. Most importantly, he admitted feeling trapped by the relationship he had formed with Evan, both drawn to it and terrified of what it meant. The diaries painted a picture of a man who was unraveling emotionally long before the night he died. The recordings altered the courtroom's understanding of what had happened. Instead of a calculated act of violence, the event appeared to be the tragic outcome of two emotionally unstable individuals, caught in a situation neither could control. Evan, overwhelmed by dependency and fear of abandonment, and Martin, gripped by the terror of exposure and loss of control, had collided in a way that made disaster inevitable. The prosecution's certainty began to crumble as the jury realized the case wasn't about simple guilt. It was about emotional collapse, manipulation, and psychological strain. Evan's final statement to the court was quiet and fragmented. He didn't attempt to excuse what had happened. He admitted that he felt lost, used, and frightened during the months leading up to the incident. He expressed remorse, not just for Martin's death, but for the life he himself had allowed to drift into chaos. His words carried the tone of someone who had spent too long navigating hidden wounds without support. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom held its breath. Evan was found guilty, but not of premeditated murder. Instead, the conviction was for manslaughter, acknowledging that the tragedy had been born from an emotional breaking point, rather than a deliberate plan. The sentence reflected a complicated understanding of the relationship, one that accepted both the gravity of Martin's death and the tangled reality behind it. The town of Lakewood Ridge didn't return to normal after the case ended. People spoke about the tragedy for months, trying to make sense of the lives hidden behind the blue house's walls. The house eventually fell into disrepair, its windows dark, its rooms silent. It stood as a reminder of how secrets, emotional confusion, and fear can twist ordinary lives into something unrecognizable. And for those who passed by, it became a symbol of a truth the town could no longer ignore. Even in places that seem calm and perfect, unseen storms can build quietly until the day they break everything apart.